Today is a big day for the Ukraine-Russia war. The US President Donald Trump will be meeting his Russian counterpart in Alaska to try to negotiate an end to the war. They're meeting at the same military base that was crucial to countering the Soviet Union during the height of Cold War and still plays a role today. There are multiple outcomes possible from this meeting, but one thing is for sure, that it will reshape Europe in ways we haven't seen in recent times. To discuss this and much more, Andreas Umland, an analyst at Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies and the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, is joining me from Berlin. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out the time and joining me on Hindustan Times.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored.
All right, thank you. We know that the Russian and American delegation must have made some kind of a breakthrough for the respective leaders to meet in Alaska. Let's start with this. What is your view? What is this breakthrough?
There's so far only speculation about this. And one of the speculation is that the breakthrough may actually have been a misunderstanding by the chief diplomat from the American side, Steve Witkoff, who may have misunderstood Putin to be ready to withdraw troops from the Zaporizhia and Kherson region, whereas that was not something communicated. So I don't see really the space here for a real breakthrough because Russia has its demands, its further territories, it's a limitation of Ukrainian sovereignty, and obviously Ukraine will not agree to that. So I'm not quite sure what this meeting can lead to.
You don't seem very optimistic about the meeting.
No, I'm not optimistic because what needed to be done first is to exert pressure on Russia via sanctions, via increased weapons deliveries for Ukraine. And the current idea of swapping territories would have made sense a year ago when Ukraine was controlling Russian territories. Then one could have swapped Russian territories for Ukrainian territories. But now Trump thinks he can propose to Ukraine to swap one Ukrainian territory for another Ukrainian territory. And of course, that is not something that Ukraine will be ready to do.
Right. Since you say that, you mentioned sanctions and weapons. The United States President Donald Trump did sanction new sanctions against Russia since coming to power. He has also allowed Patriot missiles towards Ukraine. These two things have been done by the US, but do you think Trump's usual tactic, how he deals with other countries when it comes to tariff and other issues like Greenland, with India recently, the tariff war that has been going on, do you think that kind of a mechanism, this pressure that you're talking about, can actually work against Russia?
No, I don't think that can work easily because the US and Russia don't have much trade anyway. So whatever tariffs directly on Russia are imposed will not impress Russia most. And perhaps even the US is in certain ways dependent here on deliveries of certain goods from raw materials from Russia. The issue of the secondary sanctions, as were, for instance, already imposed on India, is a much more complicated one. And it's also a dubious one insofar as the US can still use other instruments, other sanctions instruments, for instance, sanctioning the so-called shadow fleet of Russia, or it can use financial and material instruments like supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia, delivering weapons. So the US has its own instruments to directly pressure Russia, and it currently looks strange that Trump is proposing these secondary sanctions on third countries like India to exert sort of indirect pressure on Russia.
Okay, then let me ask you this. Why do you think Donald Trump is doing that?
I'm not sure. I think partly it's perhaps something done out of convenience. It's less problematic, less risky in a way for Russia. But what I'm also fearing here that it's done out of incompetence, because we've seen already many statements by Trump and his administration that are, to me at least, documenting sheer incompetence of the nature of the Russian-Ukrainian war and the origins of this war and the ways to solve the conflict. The ideas are often ridiculous. What he's saying, so he alleges that Zelensky has somehow started the war and that Putin wants peace and these things, and they simply document that he and his advisors and the people around him do not really understand the situation in Eastern Europe.
Let me also get your perspective on Ukraine and Europe, which a lot of analysts are saying are being kind of sidelined in the same war that they are very central to. What is your take on that?
Yes, this is another strange aspect of this meeting, that two non-European powers, I think Russia can be characterized as a non-European country, are deciding now the fate of a European country, and that neither the country itself, Ukraine, is invited, nor other Europeans are invited to this meeting. So we are returning here to a kind of politics, international politics, that was common before 1945, before the foundations of the United Nations, before the so-called rules-based world order emerged. Simply great powers, imperial powers, colonial powers, deciding the fate of smaller powers without them even being at the table.
So, keeping all of that in mind, sir, what do you think the US president, not just for Trump, but like in general, US's foreign policy in the long term, is trying to seek here?
I think the driving force, the major driving force for Trump's behavior is domestic affairs, domestic politics. The promise that he made in his electoral campaign that he would solve this conflict within 24 hours. And the fear that many have in America, in Europe, that this war could escalate into World War III, into a nuclear war, but also the continuing sympathy for Ukraine among ordinary Americans. We know that from opinion polls that most Americans, even many Republican voters and members of the Republican Party, even members of the MAGA movement, the Make America Great movement, are still on Ukraine's side, and they have sympathy for Ukraine, and they are skeptical about Putin, and that's why Trump is engaged in all of this at all. I think if there had not been this, if there was not such sympathy for Ukraine, he would have perhaps already made some deal with Putin. But he has to still consider American public opinion in view of the upcoming next Congress elections, for instance. So I think it's all about domestic affairs at the end of the day, and not so much about the international order or peace or justice or any of this. It's all driven by these interests, and perhaps also some economic interests, but I think they are here, in this case, secondary.
Right. I was recently speaking to the senior economist, Jeffrey Sachs. He actually said something on the same lines, that whenever the US president speaks, he mostly speaks to the domestic audience and less to the international audience. Taking this conversation further, the US president has also said that if the Friday meeting goes well, he will try to broker a direct meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. And if Trump himself is invited, then he would want to broker that as well. How optimistic are you about that?
That may happen. I'm still skeptical about all of this, because why would Russia go for any constructive negotiations? What Russia has been doing the last 11 years, since February 2014, when the war started with the occupation of Crimea, is a negotiation theater. It's a sort of performance for domestic audiences, for the international audience, that supposedly it wants a peaceful solution. But what it wants is it wants a piece of Ukraine, or it wants the larger part of Ukraine. And for that, it is ready to go into negotiations and perhaps even go for a ceasefire. But it's also ready to go into full-scale war, genocide, bombing civilian objects, bombing hospitals, whatever is necessary to get Ukraine under Russian control again.
Then what do you think Vladimir Putin's end goal is here? It cannot be just taking over Ukraine, because a lot of the European analysts are also in fear that Russia's invasion might not stop with Ukraine, it might move beyond.
What is behind that is the idea of the restoration of the Tsarist and Soviet Empire in a new form, not perhaps necessarily always with annexation, as with Crimea and the 4 mainland Ukrainian territories that have been officially annexed by Russia, but it's some sort of restoration of Russia as an empire, and then other countries also come into the focus. Non-NATO countries like Moldova and Georgia, or other Southern Caucasus countries, maybe perhaps Central Asian countries, but also NATO member countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And that is what many fear, for instance, here in Germany, where I'm currently, because if a NATO member country is attacked, then this would trigger a mechanism within NATO which would involve then directly countries like Germany and the other 30 member countries of NATO.
The US is also very much part of it. Don't you think US is thinking ahead? Article 5, I'm assuming you're referring to, that the United States is also party to that, isn't it?
Yes, the US would be also challenged by such an attack on a NATO country. That's why I'm so surprised how accommodating the US is towards Putin in Ukraine, because if Putin can get at least a partial victory in Ukraine, a victorious peace, some territory, some concessions, then his attention may turn to NATO member countries, and that would then trigger Article 5 of the Washington Treaty that established NATO, and that would demand from the US to actually do something about a Russian invasion of a NATO member country. That's why I think a victory of Putin in Ukraine is also indirectly a threat to the US, because it would then involve the US directly in a NATO-Russia conflict. That's why I'm so surprised how accommodating, how appeasing the US has been behaving the last half year.
Today at the meeting, give us a sense of the power dynamics between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. How might it look?
The experience from the Helsinki summit a few years ago during the first Trump presidency, when Trump and Putin met, is actually not encouraging, because this was, I think, a disaster for the US. This meeting between Putin and Trump back then, I think the US was humiliated actually at the press conference after this meeting, and there is the suspicion that Russia may have some so-called compromat on Trump, compromising material from his earlier biography as a businessman, and that it can pressure privately Trump with this compromising material. And so the power dynamic here is a very strange one, because Russia is, of course, a much, much weaker country than the US. In spite of its large territorial size, it has an economy approximately the size of that of Italy. So this is a bizarre, in a way, situation, but I think it will be to the advantage of Russia.
Right. Lastly, when someone looks at this entire situation from a third-person point of view, especially countries that are growing economies, India, China, Brazil, South Africa, what do you think they are calculating, rather recalculating their foreign policy?
I think the main factor here is obviously the economic implications of this entire conflict, and certain gains one can also receive from the Western sanction regime on Russia. But I think what these third players should be very much worried here about is the rules-based state order and the future role of such basic principles as territorial integrity and national sovereignty of states, because Ukraine is a full member of the United Nations. It's actually a founding member as a Soviet Republic of the United Nations. It's a member of the OSCE. It's a well-embedded country, And if this country now is made into a rump state, into a failed state, then this will open the gate for similar operations in other parts of the world. And then many weaker countries will arm themselves. They will not want to be in the shoes of Ukraine, and they will try to get weapons of mass destruction. And then you could have, for instance, a regional arms race, perhaps with weapons of mass destruction, in a region like East Asia, where countries don't believe in international law and international organizations and international solidarity anymore, and will start obtaining, if not nuclear weapons, then chemical and biological weapons to simply not get into the same situation as Ukraine.
All right, Mr. Andreas Umland, thank you so much for joining us on HD, and thank you so much for your insights.
Thanks for having me.